Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the issue of mental health. I'm going to share my screen and have you follow along with me as I talk about the issue of Black mental health, but also raise up the notion about how this is connected to be connected or not to be. And so when we think about Black mental health, one of the first things I want to say is that we ain't crazy. We're just coping with a crazy system. This is actually the title of a mental health report that was commissioned by the California Department of Public Health um, for what's called the California Reducing Disparities Project. And in it, this report details a number of the mental health issues and challenges we face in the state of California. But at the end of the day, it's really as much about systems and issues of racism as it is about issues related to mental health. So what I want to do today is to share with you some thoughts on a few things, including what is mental health and well-being, what is racial stress and trauma got to do with mental health and well-being, and just a snippet on resilience. I also want to lift up the idea that we're dealing with an assault to our humanity, and that has had an impact on our mental health, and then conclude with some thoughts on the way forward. How do we deal with this racial stress, this racial trauma with challenges to our mental health and well-being? How do we sustain and heal well-being? And how do we understand what the ingredients for well-being and mental health are? Now, when you look at definitions of mental health, typically they sound like the following. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. And over the course of your life, if you experience mental health problems, your thinking, mood, and behavior could be affected. And there are a number of factors that contribute to mental health problems, including biological factors like genes and brain chemistry, life experiences like trauma or abuse, and then family history of mental health problems. But this is an inadequate description of mental health on many levels, but most important here, it's inadequate to account for the role of context on mental health and respecting the centrality of culture when understanding mental health. Now, the World Health Organization offers a slightly more robust definition, and I argue the social ecological model in psychology uplifts several key things that tend to be missing from the things that you typically hear when people try to define this. So according to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So bottom line, for the World Health Organization, mental health is more than the absence of mental disorders. Mental health is an integral part of health. Indeed, there's no health without mental health. Mental health is determined by a range of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. And cost-effective public health and intersectional strategies and interventions exist to promote, protect, and restore mental health, or they should exist. From the perspective of social ecological theory and from an African-centered perspective, this social ecological model begins to reveal the complexity of what is mental health, because at the core here is the person, but that person exists within a microsystem of family, neighbors, peers that can support or challenge mental health, within a mesosystem like neighborhoods and churches and schools that have or do not have resources, an exosystem for example, distribution of resources in the society, and then macro system, which is the broader context of customs, ideologies, ruling priorities, the operations and perhaps machinations of things like the World Bank and the IMF. And from an African perspective, there's also the spirit system, which has a direct role in supporting someone's mental health, at least to the extent that one is spiritually grounded. And then cutting across all of these layers is what's called, in the original social ecological model by Bronfenbrenner, the chronos system, which says that history actually informs, shapes, influences the processes that are operating at all of these levels of the reality of life in the world. Now, one of the things that's important to understand about the chronos system is that oftentimes Western psychology will not pay enough attention to this historical trajectory and how that bears on a person's mental health and well-being. And as James Baldwin said, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. And we're starting to catch up with that understanding in some of the more recent work on things like epigenetics, and I'll get into that in a second. But history does matter. And as Zora Neale Hurston said, the present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell. And there's no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. And the untold story inside of us is the multi-generational assault to our humanity and our dignity, the disregard for our understanding of the world, our cultural values and perspectives, et cetera. And so we can't talk about mental health in the absence of understanding that historical reality coupled with the ongoing continued assault. The assaults to our dignity and our humanity keep coming, and they're coming at rapid pace. And that rapid pace leads to what we understand as racial stress and racial trauma. And so what we're talking about here simply is the idea that stress in racialized terms involves overtaxing personal and collective coping resources. It can threaten well-being, and it can have psychological and social consequences. So one shouldn't think about mental health from an African-centered perspective, from the perspective of Black psychology, solely as something that's operating within the individual. Mental health must operate within the context of connection to a broader community. And so one model that begins to tie some of these things together, the historical and the contemporary racial stressors that really impact our mental health, is the historical trauma theory. Historical trauma theory is pretty new in public health. The premise of the theory is that populations historically subjected to long-term mass trauma, things like colonialism, enslavement, war, genocide, exhibit a higher prevalence of disease even several generations after the original trauma occurred. So understanding how historical trauma might influence the current mental health and health status of Black populations in the US could actually yield new insights to eliminating health disparities. Simply put, a collective trauma experienced by one generation can negatively impact the well-being of future generations. And so the model posits that historical trauma originates with the subjugation of a population by a dominant group. And successful subjugation requires at least 4 elements: overwhelming physical and psychological violence, segregation and or displacement, 3rd, economic deprivation, and 4th, cultural dispossession. All of those elements are operating and influencing the psyche and the well-being of people of African ancestry, and in particular, Black folk here in the United States. And so maladaptive behaviors and related social problems like substance abuse, physical or sexual abuse, suicide, directly traumatize offspring and are indirectly transmitted through learned behavior, that perpetuating the intergenerational cycle of trauma. I could go into more on this, but time is not on my side. But this model is one way to begin to outline the modes of intergenerational transmission, so that are physiological, genetic, environmental, psychosocial, social, economic, political, and legal and social discrimination. And up here you see the mass trauma experience for the first generation or primary generations, but that trauma is then passed on in a variety of different ways and it reveals itself through a multitude of manifestations into subsequent generations. So how do we then grapple with this? I suggest that when we're talking about supporting and promoting the mental health of Black folk, we need to look at a holistic approach that involves the science and synergy of well-being. And as Isaac Perlotensky in Community Psych says, there can't be well-being, but in the combined presence of personal, relational, and collective well-being. That's where Perlotensky stops. But from an African-centered or Black psychology perspective, then you also must have the spiritual. So when we talk about our mental health and how do we promote it and what are the challenges to it, it's the intersection of all of these things. And so we can't simply look at the person and shoring up the person if we're not attending to some of these other components. And so one could ask the question, well, how are the people? How are we doing as Black folk when it comes to our mental health? Well, this infographic is one way to kind of, in a quick snapshot, give you a sense of that. We're 13.4% of the US population. Of that, over 16% reported having a mental illness in the past year. That's over 7 million people, which is more folk than the populations of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia combined. So overall, mental health conditions occur in the Black community and among Black people in America at about the same or less frequency than in white Americans. However, the historical Black and African American experience in America has and continues to be characterized by trauma and violence more than for our white counterparts in this country. But at the same time, we're dealing with prolonged suffering and immense, unrelenting racial stress that takes a toll on both physical and mental health for Black adults and Black youth and children. For example, I recently co-authored a white paper on the issue of Black child suicide. And for our children, while the rates of suicide have been climbing, while they have been declining for all other groups in this country. And I'm talking about children as young as 11 years old, particularly African-American boys, and using methods that are heartbreaking, particularly hanging themselves. So historical dehumanization, oppression, and violence against Black folk has evolved into present day racism. It's structural, it's institutional, it's individual, and it cultivates a uniquely mistrustful and less affluent community experience with lots of disparities that take a toll on our well-being and our health. So what we end up seeing in terms of the mental health field is that we are among the most unserved, underserved, and inappropriately served folks when it comes to mental health services. And the reasons for that are multifold, and they include things like our sense of stigma about mental health problems, us being restricted to evidence-based practices, which were not designed with us in mind, and are not necessarily relevant or valid for us, and we don't resonate with a number of them. Structural racism is another factor. We are basically dealing with culturally bankrupt approaches to mental health services in the mainstream mental health system. We are subject to a lot of misdiagnosis, where we're given more harsh diagnoses for the exact same symptoms as, let's say, white folks. For us, mental illness is treated as a crime, and where we should be being provided mental health services, we are in fact put in jail and prison. And then we have an adaptive dilemma where we have people who want and need mental health services, but there are not enough Black therapists that we can turn to. There's also cultural mistrust, which mitigates against our using the services that we might have access to. And then there's other barriers like cost and insurance and availability of services in general. And so this is how we look with the dilemma we face, in particular with limited options and being forced to use an intervention that has unknown efficacy for Black folk, but demonstrated efficacy for white folks in clinical trials. We're not running to those therapies. If we enter into those therapies, we don't necessarily stay through completion, and then the outcomes may not be as robust for us as they may be for others. So how do we begin to move forward? First, we have to deal with the fact that in addition to everything I just described, we have this foreboding feeling sometimes in America, not sometimes, probably oftentimes, that we are in the sunken place. And in that sunken place, we're constantly trying to verify or support our version of reality. And that version of reality sometimes is really hard to substantiate and to get validated. In conclusion, any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks the necessity of psychological freedom is only waiting to be buried. In other words, our mental health is directly tied to us being unencumbered by the effects of multiple generations of racism and racial trauma. The struggle for us is a struggle to just be our natural Black selves is hard to do in a racialized America, right? The struggle for an empowered existence in a society infused with assumptions of our inferiority and lack of acceptance of who we are on our terms is a challenge and is a constant source of stress, along with the constant barriers to the affirmation of our humanity for our youth, our families, and our communities. More interventions are needed that reflect Cheryl Grills' concept of a three-change process model that can lead to positive wellness. That's a communal change process where the change mechanism is relatedness, our being able to be connected to each other. Contemplative processes where the change mechanism is awareness, that critical consciousness that Friere talks about. And then empowerment processes where the change mechanism is agency, where we take back control of our lives and of our minds. We're doing that also while cultivating resilience. And resilience is not grit. It is not hardiness. It is not, sticking with it and just barreling our way through something. Resilience is like a pot of gumbo. It has a number of essential ingredients, which I list here in this particular slide. It is the combination of the presence of these different things that actually contribute to resilience. And we're an incredibly resilient people, but not necessarily intentionally resilient by understanding these things. We have been very resilient in terms of using our cultural tools and values, but we need to make those even more explicit. So I'm going to skip this one and say, if the community designs it, it will look different. We need to empower the community to provide tangible supports that promote our natural altruism, approaches that preserve the dignity of our people, that builds upon our ingrained compassion, and that strengthens our community ties, where we can do the work of salu bono, which means I see you and I accept and embrace my obligation for not just my own well-being, but for your well-being. And then an example of that would be creating more spaces for the community to heal itself and maintain wellness, like at Hot and Cool Cafe. It's not just a cafe, it's a healing community space. Another example, let the community design it. That would be, for example, what Community Coalition members did back in 2009, where they came up with their own model of mental health and wellness promotion, and that each of these areas had a subgroup of very detailed things the community said would in fact help. There's also the idea of when the community builds it, you have something like what I call the chairs effect, where the community of unhoused folks sometimes you wanna go actually design their own space and approach to provide access to bathrooms and toilets and basic space to be in community, laundry facilities, etc. And that thing grew from a few hundred people coming a month to 17,000 coming a month with practically no marketing. So in conclusion, I have a lot of ideas about how we can do the work of healing as transformation and not transaction for our folks, including having the community be the healers. And just in the summer of 2019, South LA offered 110 healing circles across the course of about, I think it was 8 weeks, with 1,355 South LA residents, youth and adults participating, where they came together to understand stress, de-stress themselves, address racism and racial stress and community violence and more. And we need to have more spaces where we can unpack the impact of the lie of white superiority and Black inferiority on how we see ourselves and each other. We need more forms of therapy that are armed with the truth, grounded in our people's culture and worldview, where there's a marriage of activism, agency, and civic engagement, and there is literature that supports the mental health, positive coping and resilience that emerges out of that kind of approach. And then a series of policy recommendations that say things like igniting and utilizing culture is the way forward for us, that using community building strategies and new research methods and lifting up positive psychology and resilience as frameworks and seeing community organizing as a public health strategy are in fact ways to go. Community capacity building efforts can over time lead to improvements in outcomes of well-being, not just for individuals. We have to think of mental health at the level of the community. When we do that, as you'll see now in these folks who are doing that kind of work in Omaha, Nebraska at Malcolm X's birth home, which is now the Malcolm X Center, training them, getting trained themselves to go out and be healers in their community because of the urgent need for emotional and psychological preparedness for our people. Thank you.